This is Keith Ward with Visual Studio Magazine, and joining me right now is Visual Studio Live speaker Eric Boyd. Eric, welcome.
Thank you, Keith.
Okay, so you just presented a session here at Visual Studio Live Redmond, and tell us the title and overview of what it was about.
Yeah, so I'm a Windows Azure MVP, and the session I just presented was moving web apps to the cloud in Windows Azure.
Okay, and what exactly does that mean for those who are sort of unfamiliar with why you would want to do that?
Yeah, so let's say that you are an ASP.NET developer and you have an application running in your data center, but you are scaling, or you're needing to scale in a massive way. So you have a startup that is just going nuts. You're building Facebook or Twitter or something like that. That's one example, one reason why you would want to do that. If you're a line of business developer, maybe you just want to repurpose some hardware. So maybe you have some applications that run at a very low utilization most of the time, and then they peak and spike on maybe one day a month. So for example, timesheet reporting. That's the use case we talked about in my session. There may be one day a month where that goes nuts. If I move that out to Azure, I can just kind of pay for that one day and repurpose the hardware in my data center to do something else the rest of the time.
Now, obviously, there are choices other than Azure for cloud computing out there. Why does Azure make sense for Windows-based developers?
Yeah, so the great integration with Visual Studio is really nice, but it's coming from Microsoft. So there's some real advantages to that, one being just the support that you get. So if you were to go with another vendor, you may have to go back and forth to get supported for things like SQL Server or SharePoint or something like that. Whereas when you get it all from Microsoft, you get one kind of choke point to go after for support. The other thing that's really advantageous is the way Microsoft does the service level agreements. So Microsoft calculates those service level agreements on a monthly basis. Most other vendors calculate it on an annual basis, which means there's a lot more time that you could be down to hit your SLAs. And then last, I was telling the folks that there was an independent report that I just saw from a company called Cloud Spectator. It actually ranked Windows Azure as number one. They compared 5 of the top cloud vendors. So HP Cloud, SoftLayer, Windows Azure, Amazon, and Rackspace. And they looked at performance over a 5-day period. And they also looked at cost. And Windows Azure led that analysis by leaps and bounds.
Really?
So I think there's a lot of reasons why you'd want to use Windows Azure today over the other guys.
How complicated can it be to move these apps that may have existed in your environment for possibly a long time with a lot of changes over the years?
Yeah, so the complexity kind of ranges. So let's say that you have a simple web app, a simple website that you want to move out to Windows Azure. You may just choose to move that out to Windows Azure websites. That might work perfectly for you. In that case, that's really simple. You may also go to the other end of the spectrum and say, maybe it's a little more complex, but I can just pick up my applications and move those out to Windows Azure virtual machines. And that's maybe simple, but what I get is I have to manage all of that infrastructure myself. And so in the middle is Windows Azure Cloud Services. And Cloud Services is between websites and virtual machines. I don't manage the VMs anymore, but I get full control over the VMs if I want to. So I can install legacy stuff. And so it can get a little complex in that scenario. And then dealing with the dependencies like SQL database and storage, there are some complexities, but you get all sorts of benefits. So.
Now, you talk to people about this a lot. What are some of the top questions or concerns they have when they're thinking about making this move?
Yeah, so one that we talked about in the session that I just did was vendor lock-in. So there is always some concern about if I choose vendor X, am I really locked into that vendor, or can I move to another vendor easily? There are some companies that distribute loads across multiple vendors, and so you just have to think about that up front and architect that into your application. It's not any different than the vendor lock-in that you would get if you made a decision to use SQL Server versus Oracle. There's going to be some lock-in there. You'll want to abstract that stuff away from your application somehow so that you're not just tied to those vendors.
And finally, are there some web apps that are better than others for this particular type of move? What's an example of something that would be a perfect candidate, and maybe one that would not be the best type of app to move to this environment?
Yeah, so today, PHP and ASP.NET and Node.js, they all work really well in Windows Azure websites. I think it's probably not so much about the technology, but more about the business case. So what's the motivation for you to move your application to the cloud? I think that's the most important thing, more than the technology.
Okay, very good. Eric Boyd, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Keith.